On May 5, 1944, the massive USS Colorado battleship departed San Francisco for Pearl Harbor as part of Operation Forager, the Allied effort to capture the Central Pacific from Imperial Japanese control. During an intense battle in Tinian, gunner Robert E. Lee experienced his first taste of the horrors of war when the Colorado was hit 22 times by enemy shore batteries, causing heavy damage and multiple casualties. But the worst was yet to come. For Lee and his fellow crew members, the ship was later ordered to participate in the campaign off Leyte in November, arriving just in time to endure a fierce attack by Japanese forces. As Japanese warplanes filled the sky and anti-aircraft fire lit up the air, Lee defended his ship from his gun station as explosions and bullets tore through the water around the fleet. After a sudden blinding flash, Lee looked up to see a Japanese Kamikaze aircraft diving directly toward his position, a moment that would mark a turning point in the story of the USS Colorado. USS Colorado, an aging yet powerful battleship, was a 32,600-ton vessel built in Camden, New Jersey, and commissioned in August 1923. She was the lead ship of the Colorado class and served to project U.S. naval strength abroad, operating in European waters. In late 1923 and early 1924, before being transferred to the Pacific, where she spent most of her service life. Prior to the war, Colorado was engaged in training exercises and missions such as the 1925 Trans-Pacific trip to Australia and New Zealand, and the 1937 search for missing aviator Amelia Earhart. As global tensions rose, Colorado underwent a significant overhaul at Puget Sound Navy Yard. During this period, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, launching the United States into the Pacific War. Once refitted, Colorado was deployed to Pearl Harbor to join the fight. Between November 1942 and September 1943, she was stationed in the South Pacific, helping to guard against potential Japanese incursions. Despite her age, the ship provided crucial support during the 1943 Tarawa invasion, and also during the landings at Kwajalein, Eniwak, and the Marianas in 1944. The summer of 1944 brought a major shift in fortunes. Following successes in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, the U.S. military turned its attention to Tinian, a key objective due to its strategic location and airfields. Japan had heavily fortified the island, anticipating an American attack. On May 12, 1943, additional troops were brought in to bolster its defenses, including thousands of Marines and Naval Guards, all prepared to resist a U.S. invasion. The American assault on Tinian began on July 16, led by Colorado to other battleships, 5 cruisers, and 16 destroyers, who bombarded the island's defenses. The Japanese responded with fierce resistance, making full use of their 150mm shore batteries. Colorado and the destroyer Norman Scott were both struck, with Colorado sustaining the heaviest damage. She was hit 22 times, resulting in the deaths of 43 sailors and injuries to 198 others. Gunner Robert E. Lee, who lost many friends in the attack, was deeply affected by the violence. Robert E. Lee had joined the Navy on February 14, 1944. Continuing his family's military legacy, a friendly and optimistic young man, he quickly formed bonds aboard Colorado after being assigned as a gunner on April 23. But despite his hopes, fate had a darker path in store. After undergoing repairs, Colorado was sent back into action in November to support operations in Leyte, where the U.S. campaign to reclaim the Philippines was escalating. The Japanese, growing desperate after numerous losses, increasingly resorted to suicide tactics in a last-ditch effort to slow the Allied advance. On November 27, a wave of more than 60 Japanese planes launched a surprise air raid against the U.S. fleet near Leyte. Lee's shipmate, George E. Minor, later described the attack as the ships maneuvered frantically. Enemy planes came in wave after wave. The USS Louisville took a direct hit, and with radar disrupted by surrounding islands, the fleet struggled to respond effectively. Amid the chaos, Kamikaze aircraft targeted the ships relentlessly, leading to one of the most harrowing moments in the battleship's long service. The sailors began to question the accuracy of their radar as more and more enemy warplanes poured into the battlefront. Several Allied ships sustained serious damage from gunfire and kamikaze attacks. Amid the confusion, 2 Japanese planes broke through Colorado's defensive fire and crashed into the battleship's deck in a fiery explosion that temporarily blinded many of the crew. At around 1 in the afternoon, a couple of planes struck the port galley deck. The explosions and bursts of machine gun fire echoed through the ship. Debris was flung from the fantail to the bow, soaring 100 feet into the air. The flash of the impact was so intense that it overwhelmed the senses. One sailor felt a piece of flesh strike his chest, while another nearby cried out in pain from a cut on his knee. That was the moment they realized the ship had been hit. Those who were still capable of fighting immediately turned to battle the flames consuming the deck. The scene was chaotic and horrifying. Some of the crew, including Miner, risked their lives tossing unexploded shells overboard to prevent further damage. Lee's gun was struck by debris from one of the crashing planes, and he was among the many wounded. Miner and others carried the injured to another vessel where Navy medics tried to save them. Despite suffering severe injuries, Lee remained calm and even joked with Miner while being carried on a stretcher. But the efforts of the medics were not enough to save most of the wounded. Lee, along with many others, did not survive. In total, Japanese kamikaze attacks caused 91 casualties among Colorado's crew and inflicted further damage to the ship. Still, the sacrifices of the sailors were not in vain. The Allied forces eventually succeeded in liberating the Philippines, and USS Colorado continued to support them through the final days of the war. The sailors began to doubt the radar readings, as an increasing number of Japanese warplanes flooded the skies over the battlefront. Several Allied ships suffered serious damage from gunfire and relentless kamikaze attacks. Amid the chaos, 2 Japanese planes broke through Colorado's defensive fire and crashed into the deck, erupting into a massive firestorm that temporarily blinded many of the crew. At around 1 in the afternoon, a pair of enemy aircraft struck the port galley deck. The explosions roared through the ship, accompanied by bursts of machine gun fire. Debris from the blasts was hurled from the fantail to the bow, rising nearly 100 feet into the air. The intense flash of light overwhelmed those nearby. One sailor felt a piece of flesh strike his chest, while another clutched his injured knee. In that moment, it became clear they had been hit. Those not immediately taken out by the explosions sprang into action, fighting the fires that were tearing across the deck. The destruction was almost beyond description. Sailors, including Miner, risked their lives to throw unexploded shells overboard, trying to prevent even greater devastation to the ship and their wounded comrades. Lee's gun station was struck by part of one of the crashing planes. He and others who were injured were carried to another vessel by Miner and his shipmates for medical treatment. Though badly hurt, Lee managed to keep his composure. Even as he lay on a stretcher, he cracked a joke with Miner, but the wounds were too severe. Despite the efforts of the medics, most of the injured sailors didn't survive. Lee was among those who lost their lives. The kamikaze attacks inflicted 91 casualties on Colorado's crew and left the battleship damaged. Still, the sacrifice of those aboard the ship was not in vain. The Allied forces soon achieved victory in the Philippines, and Colorado continued her service until the very end of the war. As the sky filled with enemy planes, the sailors grew increasingly uncertain about the radar's reliability. Japanese warplanes kept coming, and many Allied ships were severely hit by gunfire and suicide attacks. Amid the confusion, 2 Japanese aircraft managed to break through Colorado's defenses and slammed into the ship's deck, erupting in a massive explosion. Flames and smoke filled the air, and for a moment, the crew was blinded by the sheer intensity of the blasts. Around 1 in the afternoon, 2 planes struck near the port galley deck. The force of the explosion and the roar of machine gun fire filled the ship. Parts of the aircraft and ship's equipment were thrown high into the air, some landing from one end of the ship to the other. The light from the fire flashed across the deck, so bright it was disorienting. One sailor felt a piece of flesh strike his chest, while another nearby realized his knee had been cut. That was when they fully understood the ship had taken a direct hit. Those who had not been knocked down or injured sprang into action to battle the fires that were spreading rapidly. The destruction was overwhelming. Some of the crew risked everything to toss unexploded shells overboard before they could go off and cause more harm. Lee's gun was struck by debris from one of the planes, and he was seriously wounded. Minor and several others carried him and other injured sailors to a nearby ship, where Navy medics worked desperately to save them. Though in pain, Lee managed to stay conscious, and even made light-hearted remarks as he was carried off on a stretcher. But the injuries were too severe. Despite the efforts of the medics, many of the wounded didn't survive. Lee was among those who lost their lives in the aftermath of the attack. In total, the Kamikaze strikes killed or wounded 91 members of Colorado's crew and left the ship damaged, but their suffering and sacrifice helped pave the way for the Allied liberation of the Philippines. Colorado remained in service and continued to support the war effort until the conflict finally came to an end.